This week in our series of lessons, we have been kind of laying a foundation during each of the lessons because the things that we have been studying, really anything that you study, it requires a proper foundation in order to be clearly understood. Where you begin, your presuppositions, what you're really looking for. All of these are going to have an impact on your perspective, your view of life. So, from the very first lesson, we've mentioned two very basic truths from the book of Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 1 and verse 7 tells us the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, but fools despise wisdom and instruction, or the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. And then in Proverbs chapter 9 and verse 10, there the proverb tells us the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. Now, Solomon was searching for answers as to what life was all about. And he tells us that if you don't start with God, if the Lord is not the foundation that you're building on, you're really not going to acquire a true knowledge and wisdom about this life. You're not going to have a clear perspective of reality or of how life came to be, how life is right now, and what life will be after this life. If you look at our world or our universe, if you don't begin with Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1, if you don't begin with in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, then that will prevent you from really understanding a lot about the origin and the purpose of our universe. So this evening, I want again to show us, especially our young people, some additional evidence that won't be taught in their science classes. And this evidence affirms what Genesis 1 tells us, that God made all of the sea creatures and the birds on the fifth day of creation, and that he made all of the land animals and man on the sixth day. And those land animals included the dinosaurs. So last Saturday, when we were meeting in the library, we looked at what the Bible had to say about dinosaurs, or as we learned from that lesson, prior to 1842, all of these reptilian creatures were referred to as dragons. Now, in this series that we've been doing this past week, I didn't have the opportunity to present what the Bible has to say about Noah and the ark. Back in the fall of 2023, I presented a lesson here in Ephrata on Noah's Ark, where we considered the size of the ark. We looked at the feasibility of fitting two of every kind or family of animals in the ark. And we also showed how there would have been sufficient room to fit two of every family of animals, including two of every family of dinosaurs. We looked at the average size of a typical dinosaur, and we suggested that God most likely brought small juveniles of each kind of the larger dinosaurs. Then on Sunday, we looked at the mountain of evidence which points to the year-long global flood. So in our final lesson tonight, let's talk about what happened after the flood. And let's begin in Genesis chapter 8, beginning in verse 1. Genesis chapter 8 and verse 1. Now there we can read, Then God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the animals that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were also stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. And the waters receded continually from the earth, and at the end of 150 days the waters decreased. Then the ark rested in the seventh month, the 17th day of the month, on the mountains of Ararat. And the waters decreased continually until the 10th month, and in the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen. Now, verse 4 tells us that the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. The Bible doesn't say that the ark settled directly on what we refer to today as Mount Ararat. Now, the mountains of Ararat, they refer to a region or a range of mountains found in East Turkey and Armenia. It is in this region right here. Now, the arrow is pointing to the location of Mount Ararat. But the mountains of Ararat, they actually include 137 named mountains, and they cover an area of approximately 40,000 square miles, or about 105,000 square kilometers. So it is a huge area. And the Bible only tells us that the ark settled somewhere in this region. Now, those who have claimed to have seen remnants of the ark, those supposed sightings go back to actually the time of the Assyrian king Sennacherib in 700 BC. And then for about the last 100 years, there are claims of those who say they have seen the ark. Some say it is on Mount Ararat, while others say the ark has been seen at another location in that region. Now, let me just assure everyone, I believe 100% in the biblical account. Noah did build the ark. There was a worldwide flood, and the ark settled somewhere in the region of the mountains of Ararat. But I am very careful about believing everything I hear from men who say they've discovered something that proves some biblical story. I think I mentioned in some of our questions and answers on Sunday that there was a movie called Finding Noah that premiered in Dallas in 2015. Well, I went to that premiere showing of that movie with another brother. And after the movie, I said to the brother, they got the title wrong on the movie. It should have been called Not Finding Noah. God expects his people to only speak the truth. And making unsubstantiated claims can damage our influence and our credibility. Now, the world, secular scientists, evolutionists, they make unsubstantiated claims all the time. But God has given us plenty of evidence through his inspired word and through his creation that we can study that evidence and we can present that evidence without making exaggerations about it. As the people of God, God expects us to be able to objectively look at the evidence, determine if there's a reasonable conclusion that can be made from that evidence. Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1, that tells us, Hebrews 11, verse 1, let me see, I'm going back. Yeah. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. So our faith is not based on unsubstantiated claims. Biblical faith is based on solid, reliable evidence and revelation from God, which God has provided through, one, his word, two, through his creation. So we can know for sure what the Bible says, what the inspired word of God says. And that the ark settled somewhere in this region of eastern Turkey. Now, let's go back to our text in Genesis chapter 8, verse 13. Genesis chapter 8, verse 13 tells us, and it came to pass in the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, that the waters dried up from the earth. And Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and indeed the surface of the ground was dry. And in the second month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dried. So the flood itself lasted for about 1 year. Excuse me, my iPad is interfering and touching my screen, and it's causing it to magnify. So I'll move that away a little bit. So the flood lasted for 1 year and 10 days. And Noah and his family and all of the animals, they entered the ark a week before the flood began. So they were on the ark for a total of 1 year and 17 days. Now we know from the biblical account in Genesis 7 that the global flood, it wiped out all land or air breathing animals. This would, of course, include all of mankind except for Noah and his family. I mean, God literally wiped the earth clean, started over with 8 people on the ark, along with all the land dwelling animals. Now, if dinosaurs were on the ark, and the Bible clearly states that two of every kind of air breathing, land dwelling animals were on the ark, then they would have been repopulating the earth with their dinosaur families as the human population began to replenish the earth as well. So, is there evidence that humans and dinosaurs coexisted after the flood? Again, if you believe the truth of Genesis 1, that God created all land dwelling animals on the sixth day, then you believe that humans and dinosaurs must have lived together before the flood. And if you accept the biblical account about the flood and two of every kind of animal being kept safely on the ark, then you must also accept that dinosaurs would have been included among those animals on the ark. Now, also, if you're familiar with the chronology of the Bible, the events described in the book of Job take place after the flood, probably somewhere around the time of Abraham. Now, on Saturday and Sunday, we talked about God describing two animals that Job was familiar with, Behemoth and Leviathan. So we know that these two animals existed after the flood during the time of Job. Now, unfortunately, the philosophy of evolution has caused many to doubt these truths. Secular biologists and geologists try to tell us that dinosaurs became extinct about 65 million years before humans ever entered the evolutionary scene. Well, this evening, let's look at what the extra biblical evidence suggests. Now, there are two broad categories of extra biblical evidence that we can consider. Now, one category we can refer to as written or historical evidence. You know, just as we tell stories today of interesting things that we've seen and heard, people who lived long ago would certainly have told stories about dinosaurs or dragons, as they were called back then, if they encountered these creatures. Now, do such stories exist? I mean, is there reliable historical or written support for the coexistence of dinosaurs and humans? Now, in our lesson on Sunday, we briefly mentioned the near universal legends of a worldwide flood. There are hundreds of stories from cultures throughout the world that tell of a huge catastrophic flood which destroyed most of mankind and was survived by only a few individuals and the animals. Well, because these stories are so similar and so universal among all of the cultures and civilizations of history, that serves as strong evidence of the truth and reliability of the biblical account of the flood. Well, in the same way, we will consider the universal legends about large reptiles that lived at the same time as human beings. Now, another category that we're going to consider this evening will be the physical evidence that points to humans and dinosaurs coexisting. Are there historical artifacts that we can consider? Have men left behind evidence such as drawings or carvings which depict dinosaur like creatures? And what conclusions can we draw from these pieces of physical evidence? Now, as we have invited everyone to do since our first lesson in our series, come, let us reason together. Well, we're going to present the evidence, and we will let you draw your own conclusions about what we present this evening. Now, first, let's look at the historical or written evidence of the coexistence of humans and dinosaurs. Historians have verified a wide variety of stories or legends of large reptiles that humans have encountered through the ages. And these stories or legends come from cultures all over the world. Now, many of these creatures sound very much like dinosaurs. We find historical references to land reptiles, marine reptiles, flying reptiles of all sizes. And these just keep coming up over and over in historical written accounts. Again, remember, these animals were never called dinosaurs in the stories. Remember that in our lesson on dinosaurs in the Bible, you know why these historical accounts don't call these creatures dinosaurs. Any stories of fearfully great reptiles recorded prior to 1842 would have used the term dragon. Now, have some dragon legends been embellished over time? Well, I believe so. People since the beginning of time have exaggerated stories. So they undoubtedly said some things about dinosaurs that were exaggerations. However, these kinds of inaccuracies do not negate the overriding theme of these stories that fearfully great reptiles of many different shapes and sizes once lived with humans. And people have been giving both oral and written accounts of interactions with large reptilian creatures of all shapes and sizes. So even those who study folklore and legends are adamant that dragons, they didn't really exist. They were purely mythical creatures. I want you to consider these quotes. Now, the first one you've been looking at for a few minutes, Carl Lindahl, he's the contributing writer for World Book Encyclopedia. He admits in the World Book Encyclopedia, every country has dragons in its mythology. Now, why is that? Well, in another book on Chinese dragons, Roy Bates writes, no other creature in the world has had such a far reaching influence on the minds of so many people. Now, again, ask yourself the question, why is that? There was a 1981 Science Digest article titled The Spread of Dragon Myths. Again, they call them a myth that inform readers dragons are among the most persistent and widespread myths in the world, from millennium to millennium and over all the Earth's continents. Dragon and serpent lore shows remarkable similarity. Now, I hope you're beginning to see a theme here as we ask, why are these stories so persistent and widespread? Now, James Perloff wrote a book about dragons, and he wrote in his book, the flood is not the only common memory of the world's cultures. They also remember dragons. From England to China, these were a long part of national folklore. The Indians of North and South America had legends about them. They were written of in Ireland, France, Germany, Italy, Greece, Switzerland, Scandinavia, Ethiopia, Egypt, Persia, Russia, India, and Japan. Again, I want you to ask the question, why? Why are there so many stories about these large reptilian creatures? Now, on the inside front dust jacket of his book, Dragons, A Natural History, Dr. Carl Schuchert noted that dragons have been found in an astounding number of places. Dragons and their near relatives have found niches in every ecosystem on the planet, from the mountains of Greece to the forests of northern Europe, to the volcanic plain of Mesoamerica, to the river valleys of China, and have, as a consequence, become deeply embedded in human culture. Now, you keep asking yourself the question, why is that? Now, in his foreword on Dr. Schucher's book here of Dragons, A Natural History, Desmond Morris remarked, as recently as the 17th century, scholars wrote of dragons as though they were a scientific fact. Their anatomy and natural history being recorded in painstaking detail. Now, why is that? In their book entitled Dragons, investigators Hogarth and Clearly write, 1,000 years ago, dragons were such familiar creature that what they look like and how they behave was common knowledge to every man, woman, and child. No matter where they lived, everyone could describe dragons and dragon behavior. Now, this is so persistent that it's interesting that Animal Planet featured a film called Dragons, a fantasy made real. And within the first minute of this film by Animal Planet, they admitted there is one creature remembered in the legends of almost every human culture that's ever existed. A creature depicted with remarkable similarity by the Chinese, the Aztecs, even the Inuit, that's the Eskimos, who lived in a frozen land where no reptiles are found. Even they have stories of this animal, the dragon. Cultures from different continents, people who had no contact with one another, yet all of them have stories describing the same. Now, of course, Animal Planet thinks there's no way they could be real, the same mythical animal. And even Animal Planet could not help but be impressed by the voluminous amount of documentation for these animals. In the same film, they expressed amazement over how much was known about dragons, all the different kinds of dragons. And it's all documented in medieval manuscripts and Chinese encyclopedias. Again, Hogarth and Cleary state in their book entitled Dragons, the evidence for dragons is not confined to the works of natural history and literature, but appears in everyday chronicles of events. And such eyewitness accounts are not derived from hearsay or anonymous rumor. They were set down by people of some standing, by kings and knights, monks and archbishops, scholars and saints. And there are other well-known historical figures. Now, we don't have time to look at all the quotes from some of these historians, but others, famous historians, have documented these creatures. Pliny the Elder published a 37-volume encyclopedia of natural science, and he describes and illustrates the various types of dragons as very real, living creatures. Herodotus, another ancient historian, wrote of his travels to Arabia, where he describes seeing flying serpents whose wings were like those of a bat. Alexander the Great, in his travels and in his writings, describes a huge scaly reptile he encountered in India. And the natives asked him to leave it alone as they worshiped this animal as a god. In his travels to China, Marco Polo describes encountering huge serpent like creatures with two legs that terrified the people in that region. Now, these noted historians and travelers all described encounters with large serpents and reptiles that sound a lot like dinosaurs. Now, dragon legends are not just cute stories that our ancestors made up within the last few centuries. They have been told all over the world for millennia. The earliest reference to dragons dates back to over 4,000 years ago. That would have been shortly after the flood. Now, we said a few minutes ago when we were talking about the ark that we need to be careful not to believe unsubstantiated claims. And that is so. And if these dinosaurs about dragons were rare, and if they differed greatly in what they were describing, then I would say these are unsubstantiated tales or myths. But we're talking about thousands of stories from all over the world, from different cultures at different times, who had little interaction with one another. They span over 4,000 years of history, and the descriptions of these dragons are very detailed and they are amazingly similar. Now, I call that kind of evidence substantial. With so many stories and legends and descriptions and writings about encounters with large dinosaur like creatures over the past 4,000 years, why are historians so insistent that they are simply mythical beasts? Well, you and I both know the answer to that. If someone has accepted the philosophy of evolution, and if they have accepted the geological timetable that is absolutely necessary to support their beliefs, then they are forced to believe that men and any dinosaur like creatures could not have lived together at the same time, because evolution and the geologic timetable say that dinosaurs died out about 65 million years ago, and man, our modern man at least, did not come on the evolutionary scene until about 300,000 years ago. So if you're an evolutionist, your beliefs, again, remember, that's a philosophy. It is a belief. It is not scientific fact. So if you're an evolutionist, your beliefs force you to come up with some other explanation for all of these stories and documented accounts of these dinosaur like creatures that were called dragons. So, what are the main alternative explanations to these thousands of stories and legends and writings and drawings of dinosaurs? I mean, the stories of these animals, again, are worldwide. They're recorded in reputable historical writings as factual, real animals. And a reasonable person cannot simply just dismiss all of these references to large reptilian creatures simply because they don't like the implications. A rational explanation must be given. So, how does the evolutionist explain all of this written evidence? Well, in an article titled Top 10 Beasts and Dragons How Reality Made Myth, evolutionist Kevan explored, what may have inspired the look of dragons. And he suggested some alternatives like Chinese alligators or pythons or lizards. But his surprising explanation for the universal nature of dragon legends was not animals, but comets. And he writes, to people living in ancient times, a comet streaking through the skies with an icy tail millions of miles long would have closely resembled such a creature. He's talking about dragons. If comets were the inspiration for some dragons, it could help explain why dragons are ubiquitous in the myths and legends of so many different cultures in all corners of the world. A comet? Really? I mean, the hundreds of dragon legends around the world are indebted to comets for their existence? I mean, let me ask you, which looks more like a dragon to you? Now, Kevan does acknowledge of all the creatures that ever lived, pterosaurs probably most closely resemble the dragons of European legend. Reptilian and featherless, pterosaurs flew on wings of hide that were supported by a single long and bony finger. The pterosaur, Quetzalcoatlus, had a wingspan of more than 40 feet, making it the largest flying creature ever. But he rejects the idea of a flying reptile like a pterosaur being the source of dragon legends. And you know why? It's because he's an evolutionist. And his beliefs tell him that humans and dinosaurs, including the pterosaurs, were separated by 65 million years of time. So he's forced to come up with an alternative explanation. Now, dragons and dinosaurs also gave Daniel Cohen difficulty, and I was surprised to hear an evolution admit what so many people know all too well. He just says, no creature that ever lived looked more like dragons than dinosaurs. Like the dragons, dinosaurs were huge reptiles. Dinosaurs themselves didn't fly, but at the time of the dinosaurs, there were a number of large flying reptiles. It sounds as though the dragon legend could have begun with the dinosaurs. Through the ages, stories about dinosaurs would have been confused and exaggerated. Now, wait a minute. If it could have come from the dinosaurs, why don't you say that maybe dragons and dinosaurs could have been the same thing? Now, renowned atheist Carl Sagan, his answer to all of these universal stories about dragons, he suggested that maybe humans are remembering dinosaurs from their earlier monkey ancestors. Now I'm not joking. I mean, Carl Sagan really suggests in his book, The Dragons of Eden, that a possible explanation for dragon legends is monkey memory. Now, he recognized the fact that dragons legends, they're so common that the pervasiveness of these stories is probably, he writes it in this book, probably no accident. And I would agree with that. I don't believe all these stories are just accidental or coincidental. There's got to be a rational reason, a logical reason to explain all of these written accounts of dragon encounters. So how does he explain why so many people in the past talked about encounters with these huge reptilian beasts? Now, look at what he writes. The most recent dinosaur fossil is dated at about 60 million years ago. The family of man, but not the genus Homo, so he's talking about primitive first ape-like men, is some tens of millions of years old. Could there have been man-like creatures who actually encountered Tyrannosaurus rex? Could the pervasive dreams and common fear of monsters be evolutionary vestiges of quite adaptive baboon-like responses to dragons? I mean, notice that even Carl Sagan, one of the foremost evolutionists of the 20th century, could not get around the fact that dragons sound very similar to dinosaurs. And the best explanation that Sagan could conjure up while still holding onto some semblance of the evolutionary geologic timetable is that our very early baboon like ancestors encountered dinosaurs and somehow passed their nightmares of dinosaurs down to modern man. Seriously? I mean, once again, we find evolutionist explanations of dragon legends bizarre, irrational, and even laughable. I mean, if it were not for evolutionists' commitment to their faulty billions of years geologic timetable, they could just accept what is so obvious that dinosaurs, previously called dragons, and humans lived together on our planet after the flood. So, why do we find these stories and pictures and carvings everywhere. And why are they so alike? Well, to me, the simplest and most obvious answer is because they saw them. So there is reliable written evidence that people in the past actually encountered dinosaurs, which would have been called dragons. And that's why these stories are so similar no matter where you go. But you know, and I know, that people are afraid to say this because they know they will be ridiculed for believing what is so obvious. However, there's not just stories and written evidence to consider. There is also physical evidence of the coexistence of humans and dinosaurs. Now, let's just start with an observation about people. Now, you may have noticed that people generally enjoy showing pictures of the places they visited, the things they've seen. I mean, pictures authenticate the stories that we tell. And of course, pictures from the past are not the kind that we take today. But humans have produced paintings and sculptures and carvings and weavings of all kinds of encounters with all kinds of animals for millennia. And to any honest investigator, it simply can't be denied that ancient cultures left behind evidence of animals they'd seen. Now, some of these animals we would easily recognize, like deer, goats, monkeys, mammoths, and other animals that have been discovered around the world, carved or painted on rock walls. But there are also pictures and carvings and sculptures of animals with long serpentine necks, stout legs, elongated bodies, enormous tails. Now, evolutionists refuse to believe that these pictures could represent ancient pictures or sculptures or carvings of dinosaurs. Why? Well, again, because according to their evolutionary theories, dinosaurs became extinct 65 million years before humans ever entered the picture. And as long as they firmly believe in evolution, they simply cannot see or accept what I'm going to show you as evidence that diamonds and humans lived at the same time. Now, Jesus spoke of the Pharisees' refusal to accept the truth in Matthew chapter 13, where it says, seeing they do not see, hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. I mean, the evolutionist has blinded himself. He shut his eyes to the evidence. And as we said in our very first lesson, they are convinced, evolutionists are convinced, that we Christians are the ones who are blinded to the truth and the evidence. But I'm asking you, just consider the evidence and ask yourself, what is the most reasonable conclusion? Now, there is a complex of temples which are located in Cambodia. This is the ruin of one of those temples. And there are intricately carved statues and stone columns that fill these temples. Now, on one of these stones in particular, the ancients depicted animals, people, gods, various plants, other decorative images, and so you will see carvings of animals like this is a water buffalo, I'm told. Uh, you can see if you look carefully, there are two parrots in this particular carving. There's a monkey in this particular carving. There's a stegosaurus in this. What? A stegosaurus in this particular carving? Now, two archaeologists who are considered the foremost experts on these ruins in Cambodia, they write very matter of factly that among the vertical strip of roundels in the angle between the south wall of the porch and the east wall of the main body of the entrance, there is even a very convincing representation of a stegosaurus. Now, of major significance is the fact that these experts, they view the carving as authentic, with absolutely no hint of forgery surrounding it. Well, what do evolutionists say about it? Now, the primary objection that they have is it's got to be a fake, that the creature it depicts is not a stegosaurus. Joseph Meert, in his blog dedicated to refuting young Earth creationism, he commented about the carving. And he said, well, I thought it was a wild boar. He further commented, the problem with the carving is that it does not really look like any modern or fossilized animal. That makes it more likely that it was some drug induced illusion. Really? I mean, some ancient sculptor on drugs carved this animal from his hallucinations? I mean, another skeptical author wrote, could it be that the so called plates are in fact just a decorative tree or a bush type embellishment? The trunk is located underneath the front and hind legs, located right behind the creature, and nothing else? Could be. I mean, that's his explanation. Now, you be the judge. Does the carving look like a wild boar with a decorative tree behind it? Or does it, in fact, look very similar to a stegosaurus? I mean, any child could easily recognize what this carving was meant to represent. And in reality, it takes a massive amount of creative imagination or dishonesty to make the carving look like something other than a stegosaurus. So, why do evolutionists try so hard to discredit this carving? Well, because it implies that the carver, the artist, actually saw a stegosaurus, just like they saw all of the other animals which are carved into the columns of this temple. Evolutionists cannot accept the most obvious and reasonable explanation because it would threaten their cherished philosophy of evolution, and their idol of the geologic timetable would crumble. Let me give you another example of the Apatosaurus of southeast Utah. Now, on the underside of the third largest natural bridge in the world, this is Kachina Bridge, you can find several petroglyphs and pictographs, which rock art experts believe to be anywhere from 500 to 1500 years old. Now, the carvings are believed to be the work of the Anasazi Indians who once lived in that area in southeastern Utah. And you can see many carvings and drawings underneath the bridge on both sides of the span. Now, the most interesting piece of rock art at the Kachina Bridge, however, is this petroglyph located to the right side of the span. It's about 10 feet off the ground. And this figure is carved into the rock. It has a long, thick tail, a long neck, a wide midsection, and a small head. Now, any unbiased visitor to Kachina Bridge would have to admit that this petroglyph looks like a dinosaur, specifically Apatosaurus, or more popularly known as Brontosaurus. Now, if according to evolutionary scientists, humans never lived with dinosaurs, how did the Anasazis, who inhabited southeastern Utah from AD 500 to 1450, how did they carve such an accurate picture of an Apatosaurus onto the side of a rock wall? Now, evolutionary geologist Dennis Slipher wrote about this petroglyph in his Guide to Rock Art of the Utah region, and he says at the base of Kachina Bridge are approximately 100 elements, both petroglyphs and pictographs, dating from AD 700 to 1250. One of the most curious designs is a petroglyph that resembles a dinosaur, which is apparently of Anasazi origin based on its patination. Now, patination just refers to when you make a carving in a rock, eventually that exposed rock that you've carved away, it develops its own patination. That means oxidation by oxygen. So it will develop a film over it that shows that this is not a recently carved image. It is something that is many hundreds of years old. Now, what could further verify that this particular petroglyph depicts an actual dinosaur seen by the Anasazi Indians? Well, How about Apatosaurus fossils in the surrounding area? I mean, if the Apatosaurs ever lived in the area, then that would lend credence to the idea that the Anasazis had seen them. Well, interestingly, close to this natural park in Blanding, Utah, where there are actually two Apatosaurus hip fossils displayed in a museum. The bones were found in the 1960s, less than 50 miles from the Apatosaurus petroglyph at the National Monument. Now, an ancient petroglyph that looks like an Apatosaurus with bones from the very same type of animal found within 50 miles of the carving, taken together, to me, this kind of evidence it presents an impressive case for the coexistence of dinosaurs and humans. Now, there is an area of the Grand Canyon that's known as Havasupai Canyon. And for almost 100 years, scientists have been studying the images that the ancients drew and carved on the rock. And they've been amazed by the kinds of animals that these ancients carved or painted. Animals like the ibex and the elephant, which indicates that these animals once lived in this region along with Native Americans of that area. But something else has caught the attention um, of, of, of the scientists, and that's this figure cut into the sandstone actually more deeply than the elephant that we're looking at right here. Now, the carving's height is about 1 foot. Now, what kind of an animal is it? What kind of animal had a long neck, long tail, wide body, and once roamed northern Arizona? Now, some scientists believe, and I agree with them, that this is probably an ancient drawing of a dinosaur. One scientist wrote, the fact that some prehistoric man made a pictograph of a dinosaur on the walls of this canyon upsets completely all of our theories regarding the antiquity of man. The fact that the animal is upright and balanced on its tail would seem to indicate that the prehistoric artist must have seen it alive. Now, once again, we have a carving of an animal that looks more like a dinosaur than any other animal living or extinct. And all of the evidence provided by researchers who are evolutionists points to the carving being genuine. There are also fossil footprints, which prove that dinosaurs once lived in the same general area of the dinosaur like rock art. So, I ask you, how could a Native American have drawn an accurate picture of what we recognize as a dinosaur? Well, the logical conclusion is that man once lived with dinosaurs. So the carvings at Cambodia, natural bridges, Havasupai serve as strong evidence that man and dinosaurs coexisted at the same time. Now let's look at another piece of evidence. And in a small obscure town of Acambaro, in the state of Guanajuato in Mexico, you'll find one of the most unique antiquities collections in the world. Now, in 1945, there was a German hardware merchant named Waldemar Julesrud that was looking for ancient artifacts, and he came across a partially buried clay figure at the bottom of a mountain known as El Toro. Well, Julesrud eventually collected over 33,500 of these ceramic figurines. And what got scientists' attention was the fact that many of the figurines depicted
Wow.
reptiles that closely resembled dinosaurs. Furthermore, these figurines predated dinosaur fossil discoveries by hundreds of years. So, any accurate information regarding dinosaur anatomy would have necessarily been from the ancient civilization's interaction with the creatures. And to me, perhaps the most powerful piece of evidence confirming the authenticity of the Julesrud collection is a knowledge of dinosaur anatomy present in the figurines, specifically one aspect of the sauropod anatomy that was unknown until the 1990s. Now, prior to the early 1990s, Sauropod dinosaurs were constructed with smooth backs. The huge plant-eating dinosaurs such as Diplodocus, Brachiosaurus, Apatosaurus, they were believed to have no spikes on their backs, and they were drawn without them in all the journals, all the books, all the magazines. But in 1992, a fossilized sauropod was discovered which had dermal spines and plates. Now, the Jules Rudd collection was discovered between 1945 and 1953, over 40 years before this new species of sauropod was discovered. Yet, if you look at the early photographs of the Jules Rudd collection, the picture shows some of the sauropod dinosaurs in the collection have spines and plates. Now, how do you explain this? The logical explanation as to how the Jules Rudd figurines possess accurate dinosaur anatomy that was unknown until 1992 is simply that the ancient artists who produced the figurines saw the dinosaurs. And we see something similar in the funeral stones in Ica, Peru. Now, in 2004, I visited a museum in Ica, Peru with several Peruvian brothers. And here in this particular museum, there are some very interesting pre Incan artifacts. Now, it was initially started, this museum, by Dr. Javier Cabrera in the 1930s. Dr. Cabrera collected Incan burial stones, eventually gathering over 11,500 of these stones, some very small and some very large, like this one. Now, depicted on the stones are what appear to be relics of the ancient Indian culture that predated the Incans. Now, many of the carved stones, they just exhibit mundane scenes that would be expected in any ancient culture. But some of the stones, some of the carvings portray humans in close contact with dinosaurs. Now, this particular rock carving looks like a sauropod, and what does it have on its back? Dermal plates. Now, that this culture carved these figures, which look like dinosaurs, that presents a big problem for evolutionists who believe that humans and dinosaurs were separated by 65 million years. Now, I personally believe that some of the stones probably were not originals from the pre Incan culture. Some appear to be forged, probably because Dr. Cabrera was paying natives for any burial stones that they brought to him. But some of the stones, especially those with dinosaurs on them, these have been tested. They have found to have a patina. Again, that's a layer of oxidized minerals that forms on the carvings. And this patina is consistent with stones hundreds of years old. And one piece of evidence that points to the stones being authentic is that the stones exhibit numerous depictions of dinosaurs, many of which are sauropods, and the sauropods, again, have dermal plates, as you can see on these figurines. Now, remember that the dermal spines on sauropods, that was completely unknown at the time that these stones were collected. It wasn't again until 1992 that scientists found fossilized skin impressions that where they learned that some of the sauropods actually had dermal spines or dermal plates along their backs. Now, if these stones were fakes from the 1950s, how would the alleged forgers have known to put dermal spines or plates on some of the sauropods? Well, to me, the rational explanation is they actually saw these living reptiles. Now, if you travel out from Ica into the Atacama Desert, you can find mummified burial remains out in the open desert. Now this was over 20 years ago. I do not know if these are still in the desert or if they've been moved to a museum at this time, but they have found woven burial blankets around the mummies, and this particular one had an interesting pattern on it. This looks like a woven representation of a dinosaur. And then, if you go into the capital city of Lima, there are several museums which have pottery and ceramics and sculptures from ancient cultures in Peru. And you find on these ceramic pieces or paintings or carvings, you find dragon like or dinosaur like figures. Now, once again, here you have multiple cultures from this part of the world displaying these dinosaur like dragons. And to me, the logical and most reasonable conclusion is that the ancient people saw the dinosaurs, interacted with them, carved or painted accurate pictures of them in their pottery, ceramics, tapestries, and burial stones hundreds of years ago. Now, we only have time to look really at one more type of physical evidence. I want to show you some of the fossilized footprints that come actually from Texas. Now, according to evolutionary theory, we are told that the dinosaur tracks at Glen Rose, Texas, these were made at least 100 million years before humans were supposed to have evolved. Now, these particular tracks or footprints are called the Taylor Trail. Were found in the Paluxy Riverbed close to Dinosaur State Park in Glen Rose, Texas. Now, excavations were made because the tracks were covered by other rock layers in the riverbank. And the trail was discovered to continue under the excavated rock layers, proving that these tracks were not carved by creationists in the 1930s, as many evolutionists claim. Now, one of these tracks is called the Delk track. Now, this fossil footprint was found in July of 2000 by an amateur archaeologist. Alvis Delk was his name. He was from Stephenville, Texas, and you can find this track. Uh, uh, it's on display at the Creation Evidence Museum there in Glen Rose, outside of the park. Well, Mr. Delk, he found the loose slab against the bank of the Paluxy River, about a mile north of Dinosaur Valley State Park. When he flipped the rock over, he saw an excellent dinosaur track. So he took it home and it sat in his living room for years with a lot of other fossils that he had found. Well, early in 2008, he decided he would sell the dinosaur track, thinking that the nearby Creation Evidence Museum might buy it. So he began to clean the rock. And that was when he discovered the fossil human footprint underneath the dried clay. Now you can see that the human footprint had been made first, and shortly after, before the mud dried, a dinosaur had stepped in the mud with its middle toe stepping on top of the human track. Now, evolutionists have said for many years that the human footprints in the Paluxy riverbed, they were just carved by creationists. Well, to prove that this footprint was not carved, the Creation Museum took the footprint to the Glen Rose Medical Center, where spiral CT scans were performed on the rock. They made over 800 images. They documented the pressure marks within the rock that correspond precisely with the fossil footprints. Of course, carvings would show no corresponding pressure marks beneath them. And the existence of these stone contours beneath the fossil footprints dramatically demonstrate that these tracks were not carved. They are authentic. But why do evolutionists insist that these human footprints in the same rock layer as dinosaur footprints are faked carvings? Well, of course, they believe dinosaurs and humans cannot be stepping into each other's footprint because they live 65 million years apart. And at one time, you could see a trail of human footprints which traversed the path of dinosaur footprints. Unfortunately, when this evidence was presented at a symposium in Dallas, shortly after that, someone had gone to the park and they had destroyed the toe sections of every human footprint. Now, evolutionists, they've been aware of these kinds of tracks, and they were claiming that they were carved by creationists since the mid 1900s. So why not just accept the simplest, most obvious explanation that a human made these human footprints? Now, fortunately, both the human prints and dinosaur prints were measured. They were extensively photographed before the human prints were destroyed. And you can see those photos on display at the Creation Museum in Glen Rose. But sadly, there are some people who just can't handle the truth, and they would rather destroy the evidence than consider the implications of the evidence. Now, if humans and dinosaurs lived together on the earth in the past, what would you expect to find to verify their coexistence? Well, you'd expect to find written reports of dinosaur encounters, now or dragon encounters, now called dinosaurs, along with paintings and sculptures of these creatures. We've looked at both of these lines of evidence this evening. And as I've said in earlier lessons, it's time we reclaim the true story of the dinosaurs. We can use the biblical account along with the written and physical evidence to teach our children and grandchildren about the awesome power of the one who created these magnificent creatures. I mean, does it matter whether dinosaurs lived during the time of man? Yes, it does, because the Bible plainly states that all land animals were created on the sixth day along with man. To question what the Bible has revealed in Genesis, as well as what the book of Job says about Behemoth and Leviathan, is to question the truth and the reliability of God's word. So, how do you interpret the evidence that we have seen this evening? Well, that will depend on your worldview, which really depends on what you want to believe. I mean, we have conclusively demonstrated that the weight of evidence conforms to what is revealed in the greatest book of knowledge ever written, the Bible. Only the Word of God gives us the inspired insight into the creation of dinosaurs, their burial in a worldwide flood, and their contact with humans after the flood. But God's not going to force a person to accept his word. I mean, Jesus invites us in Revelation 3:20, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and dine with him, and he with me." Well, sadly, the response that many have is that they refuse to open the door of their mind and their heart to their Creator. And Paul writes of their attitude in Romans chapter 1, verse 28. And even as they did not like or refused to retain God in their knowledge. But I don't believe that describes the hearts of everyone, especially those of you who are listening this evening. Now, God doesn't force anyone to accept the truth. He reveals himself through his word and through his creation. And God has left us plenty of evidence to be able to know that he exists and that he is our creator and that his word is absolutely reliable from the first verse in Genesis to the last verse in the book of Revelation. But as we encounter the philosophies of naturalism and evolution, there's the pressure to conform, to just think like everybody else thinks. That's why we've been presenting these lessons, to strengthen our faith in the reliability of God's word and to be able to do what Peter tells us to do in 1 Peter 3:15. Always be ready to give a defense to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you. And I hope that these lessons have done just that, given you that ability. So I thank you for your time during these lessons. I thank you for the studies that we've been able to share with one another. I hope you've been encouraged by them. And I think we discussed on Sunday we would take some time to answer any questions that anyone might have. So I'm going to stop sharing the PowerPoint now